In this lesson, SharePoint 2013 Basics, what I want to do is go over, well, a bit of the basics of SharePoint 2013. Then I want to start by defining what SharePoint is, and then move into a lot of the different moving parts that make the SharePoint magic happen. One of the things that I find when students are first trying to get in and figure out what SharePoint is all about is that they're sort of bombarded, overwhelmed with all the different moving parts and all the different terminology, especially because some of that different terminology, like web application versus site, might be synonymous outside of SharePoint, but inside of SharePoint means something very particular. Now, if you've experienced SharePoint 2007 or 2010 in the past, then a lot of this will probably be review for you. But one of the things, again, that I find is that people still do benefit from just going over one more time kind of what everything is, and it might help bring a couple of things together for you. In the meantime, let's get rolling by talking a bit about what SharePoint is. I think the best word that you can use to describe SharePoint is platform. Now, SharePoint does quite a bit for you out of the box. Right out of the box, I can get it to be an intranet solution so that my users, teams, departments can go ahead and create their own site structures, their own sites, their own lists, their own libraries to be able to share and collaborate over information. It can be a workflow host. So that way, if we're looking for something to manage, say, accounts receivable, accounts payable, onboarding of new employees, or even something as simple as a time off request, SharePoint can do that relatively easily. And SharePoint can also serve as a portal, so that if I've got information both inside and outside of SharePoint, maybe inside of a database or available through a different web application, SharePoint can still be the front end for that data. So it's kind of one-stop shopping. But really, I think the biggest thing that describes SharePoint is it's a platform. That SharePoint allows you to create your own custom solution so that if you see that SharePoint doesn't do something that you'd like it to do, you can make SharePoint do it. If you see that SharePoint does do something that you don't wish it would do, you can make SharePoint not do that. So it serves as a fantastic platform. SharePoint comes in a few different varieties. First and foremost is SharePoint Foundation. SharePoint Foundation is the free version of SharePoint, free of course if you have a copy of Windows Server, and it's there to serve as a basic intranet solution. A lot of the different enterprise features that you'd be looking for, things like user profiles, search, and some of the BI technologies are not going to be available to you with SharePoint Foundation. That being said, SharePoint Foundation can still be a very viable option for small to medium-sized organizations. SharePoint Server 2013 Standard builds on top of SharePoint Foundation. And this is the biggest thing to keep in mind about SharePoint Server, both Standard and Enterprise, is that really, sort of like the name implies, SharePoint Foundation is in fact the foundation, and the server products build on top of that. So you can do everything inside of SharePoint Server Standard or Enterprise that you could do in Foundation. It's just that Standard and Enterprise are going to bring additional functionality to the table. The couple things that are worth highlighting from SharePoint Standard are Enterprise Search, User Profiles in My Sites, and then finally our Manage Metadata, which gives us the ability to create a centralized catalog of metadata that could be used throughout the entire enterprise. And then finally, last but not least, is SharePoint 2013 Enterprise, where the biggest thing that it brings to the table is BI capabilities. Things like Performance Point, which allows for your users to actually do up self-service BI, Access Services, which allows us to publish databases out to SharePoint, and then finally Excel Services, which allows us to leverage the investment in Excel documents. So if you've got Excel documents with different charts, pivot tables, and otherwise, you can, through the magic of Excel Services, be able to leverage that and make that information available through SharePoint without the client having to have Excel installed. Now, in technical terms, SharePoint is a Windows add-on, either for Server 2008 R2 with Service Pack 1 or Server 2012. Keep in mind that SharePoint is a 64-bit application. SharePoint is also an ASP.NET application, and this is one of the biggest things that I always like to drill home because it explains why SharePoint does a lot of the different things that it does. One of the things that we're going to see as we investigate SharePoint in this lesson, as well as future lessons, is the fact that SharePoint builds on top of IIS, and a lot of the different things that we're going to be doing in SharePoint will wind up modifying or requiring different changes inside of IIS. So SharePoint is an ASP.NET application. Finally, SharePoint is a front end to SQL Server. Most all of the data that your users are going to be accessing that's stored inside of SharePoint will be inside of SQL Server. In particular, it'll be inside of content databases, but it will be inside of SQL. As I mentioned, SharePoint is an ASP.NET application, thus it requires IIS. So if you haven't experienced IIS a whole heck of a lot, probably worth taking a couple of moments here to talk a little bit about the different moving parts inside of IIS. First of all, in IIS, for us to be able to serve up any page at all, we need to create what's known as a website. And our website is going to be the entry point for different applications. We can basically create as many websites as we might want, as long as each one of them differs based on one of three things: the port number, the host name, or the IP address. So the port number is the number that's going to be typed in at the end, and it tells TCP/IP which port number to use behind the scenes. The standard, of course, is 80, and you might decide to use a non-standard port just for testing purposes. Because the one nice thing about changing just simply the port number is that unlike the host name or the IP address, where we're going to need to update DNS, I don't need to do that for a port number. I can just simply type out whatever the address is, colon, and then the port number. The problem, however, is that most users are not going to be trained in this. So creating different sites with different port numbers is perfect for testing, perfect for development, not so hot for production, not something that I'm going to make public facing. The next thing that I can differ by is hostname. So the box is going to keep the same IP address. I'm just simply going to go to DNS and tell it to use an additional hostname. And the host name is going to be really anything to the left of the domain name. So if our domain name was geektrainer.com, then our host name would be sales, or the full name would be sales.geektrainer.com. The big thing about doing this with a different host name is I can't simply go into IIS and tell IIS, hey, this website is going to answer on this host name. I'm also required to update DNS. And then finally, last but not least, is an IP address. I can just simply add in a brand new IP address to the server and then configure my website to use that IP address. But again, sort of like the port number, where my users are not going to be expecting to type in a number, my users are not going to be expecting to type in an IP address. As a result, I am also going to need to update DNS manually. The other big moving part inside of IIS is what's known as an application pool. An application pool is, as I like to call it, a baby web server, because it's the application pool that will actually be doing the work and serving up the pages. That each application pool will have at least one, if not multiple instances of the W3WP exe worker process. Now, the big thing to keep in mind about your application pools is that they are going to be separate memory space, separate processes, separate accounts. And it's also going to have separate copies of the application pools for the DLLs that are going to be needed. So if we break this down a little bit, advantages and disadvantages to creating multiple application pools. What you're going to notice on the advantage side is that I do get additional stability, because if one application pool crashes, it's not going to impact any of the others. I get increased security because I can use different accounts for each pool. And I also have the ability to recycle each pool, or basically restart each pool without impacting any of the others. The big disadvantage is performance. And this is a slight oversimplification, but it still mostly holds true. For every single website that I create for SharePoint and put into its own separate application pool, what's going to wind up happening is I'm going to wind up with a separate copy of SharePoint for each one of those sites. That is going to slow things down. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes that I see made by people who first deploy out SharePoint is every time they go into SharePoint and create a brand new web application and a new website inside of IIS to hook up to that, they create a brand new application pool. Now, part of this is because the UI sort of nudges you in that general direction, but it is something that you want to avoid. That unless you have a very specific reason to put an application pool off on its own separate set of websites, you really want all of your websites to share that one application pool. Now, you might decide to split off a website for, say, security purposes. You might decide to do it because maybe I'm doing both staging and production on a server just simply to save a little bit of cost, and I want to make sure that I'm keeping my production and my staging separate from one another. But on the whole, I really want to be very careful about that unless we've got a very specific reason to take our websites and split them up into different application pools, I generally want to share them inside the same application pool. Let's turn our attention to the logical architecture of SharePoint. What you're going to notice for our hierarchy is up at the very top, we've got our farm, which is a collection of servers. Our farm is going to house different web applications, which, as we're going to see, will plug into IIS. Our web applications will house site collections, which is going to be a collection of sites. Our sites will then actually provide the structure and the UI for our users, and they will contain lists which will contain our data. Let's break each one of these down. First up is my SharePoint farm. My SharePoint farm is simply multiple SharePoint servers that are designed to act as one unit, act as one entity. The big thing about a SharePoint farm is that it's going to share a single config database. That config database is going to know what each server on the farm is going to do. So I may have servers performing different roles, offering up different services. The config database knows all, tells all, and will forward any requests to a server that is running the desired service. So my servers can play different roles. Could be a web server, serving up web pages to my users. Could be an application server, running different services behind the scenes. Or, of course, it could be a database server, housing our databases, including, well, our config database. The next big moving part that we have is our web application. Our web application simply exists to act as a go-between between SharePoint and IIS. So every time that you want to create a brand new application, you're going to need to create a new website inside of IIS. Now that raises the question, well, why in the world would I ever want to create brand new web applications? Well, the biggest reason to create a web application is for different features that are configured inside of IIS at the website level. Because again, our web application plugs into that website. So this could be potentially for authentication purposes. That if I have one part that I only want to use Windows authentication, another part that I'm wanting to use, say, ADFS, and another part that I'm wanting to use, say, forms-based authentication, the best way for me to configure that most of the time is going to be with separate web applications. My web application also serves as a context for content databases. I may decide, for performance purposes, to take very large sites and split them up into separate databases for performance purposes. I can create as many databases as I need to a certain extent, with the one big catch being that my content databases cannot span multiple web applications, that my web application is going to be a context for my content databases. And then finally, last but not least, is that at the web application level, I can choose which service applications I want that web application to run. Now, service applications is a subject we're going to talk about in a later lesson. But what I want to mention for right now is that my service applications are a lot of the big back-end things that SharePoint's going to do. For example, search is a great example of a service application. I may have in one farm two separate web applications, one for my R&D team and then one for the rest of the environment. And one of the rules that we may have about R&D is I need to be very careful about where that data could potentially be accessed from. So I might decide, you know what, for search purposes, I want to create two separate installations of search. That I want to do one for R&D, so that way it's only going to search and index just R&D, and then I want to do one for whatever's going to be public-facing to the rest of our organization. And that would be our search implementation that's now going to crawl and index everything else. If I have different service applications and I want to configure a couple of separate ones, I'm going to need different web applications for each. The next step down is my site collection. Now, my site collection serves as a boundary. It serves as a container for sites. Now, at the boundary level, it's going to be a navigation boundary, so SharePoint is not automatically going to create links between my different site collections. I could go in and do that on my own, but SharePoint out of the box isn't going to do that. It's also going to be a boundary for content database. That I mentioned before that I can have multiple content databases for a single web application. Well, a single site collection cannot span multiple content databases. And then finally, last but not least, is security. Now, one of the big roles that I can give to somebody is what's known as an SCA, or Site Collection Administrator, which basically gives you complete control over the entire site collection. If I make you an SCA of one site collection, that doesn't give you permissions to any of the others. So why would you want to create multiple site collections? Well, part of it could be because of security reasons. Part of it could be because of the need to create different content databases. And part of it also could be because at the site collection level, we have what's known as a feature scope, which basically just simply means that my features can be turned on or turned off at the site collection level. So if I've got something where I want it to be available in one site collection but not in another, then I'd need to go in and create a separate site collection. Additionally, my site collection also serves as a quota container. So I can create quotas on the site collection level. Now, one of the big things to keep in mind about quotas in SharePoint is that quotas are going to be for all users. There are no per user quotas in SharePoint, and they're also going to be at the site collection level. And then finally, last but not least, is search. There are certain search features that are only configurable at the site collection level. Now, as I mentioned, my site collection is a container for one or more sites. My sites provide UI, they provide structure, and they are containers for lists and for other sites. Every site that you create is going to be based on a template, and that template will set up all the defaults. So it will create the different subsites and lists automatically for you that you can then go in and modify to your own heart's content. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that each site collection is going to contain one and only one top site. That top site is going to be the starting point for all child sites. The URL for a top site is going to be based on a managed paths, something which we'll talk about a little bit later. My managed paths are created on the web application, and that's all the different places where I'll be able to create my site collections. Now, the only thing that's truly special about a top site is that that's where I can go to configure certain site collection options. But beyond that, my top site is at the end of the day just simply a site. My sites, as I mentioned before, are containers for lists, or more generically, apps. My lists are containers for my data. They're very similar to tables in a database, because just like tables in a database, they'll have columns, only instead of having rows, my lists will have list items. Now, my list can go by other names that, like I mentioned before, more generically, my list is an app. And my list can also go by the term of library for more specific types of lists, like a document library. You'll notice, however, that I'll continue just to use the term list because I find that that causes the least amount of confusion. Now, to roll all of this back up again, our lists again are containers for data contained inside of a site. Every site collection that we create will have one and only one top site. That's going to be my user interface, provide my structure, collection of lists based on a theme, and it's also worth mentioning that my site can be a scope for features as well. My site collection is going to have quotas and boundaries, and I can optionally at the site collection level create a brand new content database. You'll notice that it's one top site per site collection. Now, from there, I can create basically as many child sites as I want off of my top site. My site collection is contained inside of my web application. My web application can basically have as many site collections as I may need. My web application is going to set the authentication mechanism, and it does require a content database because it's going to set the scope for my content database. Also, at the web application level, that's where I can configure my different service applications. And then finally, down at the very bottom in IIS is my website. And I can create my different websites based on the port number, the IP address, and the host name. And my websites will go into application pools. Let's talk a bit about the physical structure of SharePoint, the different moving parts that we have. First of all, we're going to have a web server. Web server is designed to serve content for user, and it's the only server that my users need to have access to. The back-end application and database servers, my users are not going to connect to. Next up are my application servers. My application servers provide behind-the-scenes functionality, things like access services, Excel services, and search. Now, how you're going to set up your application servers is going to vary based on your organizational needs. So if you are migrating a lot of old Access databases into SharePoint, then obviously Access Services is going to be something that would be very important to you. So you might decide, all right, well, we're going to dedicate one or two servers for being Access Services. Or you might be migrating an application that doesn't have any access whatsoever, so Access Services in your environment is going to maybe not even be turned on. So it really depends on your environment as the location and the number that you're going to have. Now, that being said, what's nice about the application servers is that with really just a couple of exceptions, it's very easy for me to modify my architecture, that I can install SharePoint, join it into the farm, and stop and start my services as needed. SharePoint, like I mentioned, is a front end for a database. My databases come in a whole host of different varieties. The first big one that we've got is our config database. Every farm will have one and only one config database. Our config database knows all, tells all about SharePoint and what's going on in the farm. My content database sort of like the name implies, houses my content. And then finally, last but not least, are my different application databases used for search, Excel services, access services, managed metadata, and so forth. Now, when it comes to planning and sizing your databases, because depending on the different type of application you were talking about, you're going to notice that the sizing and overhead requirements are going to vary. Microsoft does have a white paper that lays out every single database, the expected size, and what I should do to optimize that database. And you'll notice the link right there that you can follow to go see all of those database types. It's one of those white papers that is pretty much required reading for every SharePoint administrator. Now, I will say, to close off this slide, that one of the big things about SharePoint is that every time it asks you for a database, it'll also ask you if you want to put it onto a different server. So if you need, again for performance purposes, to put different databases on different servers, SharePoint is just fine with that. Now, one of the biggest questions that I always get asked is, hey Christopher, what should be our default deployment? And my answer is, well, it depends. It really depends on your environment, the need for high availability, the number of users that are going to be connecting, how heavily they're going to be using SharePoint, what you're going to be doing. There's a lot of moving parts. And so what I want to do here is highlight a couple of different possible scenarios for doing SharePoint deployment. One of the possibilities is to do a single server deployment with both SharePoint and SQL on the same box, or a very basic two-tier where you have SharePoint on one box and SQL on another box. This is ideal for very small organizations, or sometimes you may have a department that requires their own SharePoint deployment. And as we all know, the number one driving force behind all IT decisions is, of course, politics. And so you may have fought the valiant fight to just have them rolled up into your existing farm and lost it. So at that point, you might decide, okay, fine, you know what, here, you get a single server and be done with it that way. Now, personally, I'd really recommend rolling them on into Office 365, but that's sort of a conversation for another time. The next scenario is a small farm. 2 SharePoint servers, 2 SQL servers doing always on, mirroring, clustering, or otherwise behind the scenes. This is your most common starting point because it gives me my high availability, and for most small to medium-sized organizations, this will give me a great starting point as far as performance goes. And then, of course, I can scale from there, where I'll be setting up multiple SharePoint servers, different web servers, splitting off a server to just be application servers, splitting off something to be my search server, and then behind the scenes have multiple databases, maybe split out onto multiple servers to serve all of this. Quite frequently, what's going to happen is you will start with the small farm that we saw and then grow to something like this based on your needs. There is the basics of SharePoint. I'll see you in the next lesson.